The night Comfort decided to stop answering her mother's calls. She was sitting on the floor of a small room in America, with her back against the bed frame and her knees pulled to her chest. Not because there was no chair. There was a chair. But the chair was where she kept the unpaid bills, and she did not want to move them. Moving them would mean looking at them. Looking at them would mean counting again. And she had already counted 3 times that evening, and the number never changed into something she could breathe around. Her phone lit up on the floor beside her. Dorcas. Then again. Dorcas. Then a message from Steve that she did not open. Then a voice note from Layla that began with, "Sister Comfort, I hope you are not sleeping because..." And she pressed stop before the sentence could finish. She sat in the silence of that small room and listened to the fridge hum. It hummed the way tired things hum when they are nearly empty. Outside, a car passed slowly. Someone somewhere in the building was frying something, and the smell came faintly through the gap under the door. Comfort pressed the back of her head against the mattress and closed her eyes. She was not angry yet. Anger would come later. That night, she was only exhausted in the deep place where sleep cannot reach. But to understand why that room and that silence mattered, you have to go back. You have to go back to a compound at the edge of a community where a girl once washed clothes with cracked fingers and kept a notebook full of places she had never been. Emmanuel's compound was not a poor man's house by shame. It was a poor man's house by circumstance, the kind of poverty that arrives slowly and stays until it becomes familiar. The zinc roof made a sound like rolling drums whenever rain fell. The sitting room had plastic chairs in 3 different colors because they had been bought at different times when money briefly appeared and then disappeared again. There was a wooden table in the center that had survived more arguments than any table deserved. On the wall hung a faded calendar from a church crusade 3 years past, and beside it, a framed photograph of Emmanuel in his younger days, standing straight in a suit that no longer existed anywhere in the house. Food in that house was never wasted, because it was never abundant enough to waste. School fees arrived late every term, carried in with the apology that things were tight. Every child in that compound understood, without being told, that wanting too much was a kind of sin. Comfort was the second child and the one who never learned that lesson. She was the one who stayed awake after everyone had gone to sleep, lying on the mat she shared with Layla, writing in her old notebook by the dim glow of a rechargeable lamp that was always half-charged. She wrote down names of countries. She wrote down words she had heard on the radio. She wrote down questions she did not know how to answer, yet. Like, why must poverty follow a family the way a shadow follows a body, even into sunlight? She was not angry when she wrote these things. She was searching. During the day, Comfort helped Dorcas in the kitchen, went to school when fees had been paid, and sometimes stood at the roadside near a woman called Mama Bisi, who sold pepper soup from a large pot. Mama Bisi did not pay her, but she fed her and sometimes pressed a small amount into her hand at the end of the evening, and Comfort kept that money separately from everything else, in a small envelope at the bottom of her school bag, building something that had no name yet. She listened to everybody who had traveled and returned. She listened to the man in church who came back from London with a new confidence in his shoulders. She listened to a woman on the radio who talked about scholarships and application processes. She listened to a neighbor's son who returned from abroad with a phone that nobody in the compound had seen before. When she asked him questions, he laughed and said she was too serious for her age. She thanked him and went home and wrote down everything he had said anyway. This was Comfort at 16, 17, 18. Collecting, preparing, believing. Her family saw something different. They saw pride. One evening in the rainy season, when the zinc roof was loud and the sitting room smelled of damp cloth and kerosene, Comfort sat across from her family with a piece of paper she had been holding since. She had heard about a travel opportunity through a church notice board, a program for young people. With application forms and requirements, she had already begun gathering information about. She had waited for an evening when everyone was present, when the day's arguments were over and the food had softened people's moods. She explained it carefully. She used simple words. She showed the paper. Steve was sitting near the doorway, leaning back on his plastic chair, cleaning under his nails with a thin broomstick. He was the eldest child, 23 years old, with the particular confidence of someone who had never had his confidence tested by anything serious. He laughed before Comfort even finished her second sentence. "America," he said, stretching the word like it was a joke his mouth was enjoying. You! Comfort, please allow us to rest. Layla, who was sitting on the mat folding wrappers, giggled without looking up. She was younger than Comfort by 2 years and had learned early that agreeing with the room was easier than thinking for herself. Dorcas, standing in the kitchen doorway with a wooden spoon in her hand, looked at the paper with narrowed eyes. Where is the money for this kind of thing coming from? She asked. Is it the money that fell from the sky? Emmanuel looked at Comfort over his newspaper. His reading glasses sat on the edge of his nose. He was a man of few words, but the words he chose always carried the weight of finality. Some dreams are not for people like us, he said. Stop disgracing yourself with big talk. He returned to his newspaper. The conversation was over before it had been given a chance to breathe. Comfort folded the paper slowly. She did not cry in the sitting room. She had learned not to. She said goodnight, went to the mat, lay down beside the sleeping Layla, and stared at the ceiling where a water stain had been spreading for 2 years. Some dreams are not for people like us. She turned the sentence over in her mind, the way a person turns a stone to see what is living underneath. She was not looking for anger. She was looking for the place where the sentence was wrong, and she found it before the night was over. She picked up a notebook in the dark and wrote one line. I refuse to inherit this. The words followed her everywhere after that evening. They followed her to Mama Bissie's pepper soup stand. They followed her to the market where she sometimes carried loads for traders to earn small change. They followed her to the church hall where she sometimes did small jobs arranging chairs and sweeping before service. Every morning she woke up and the words were already waiting. Some dreams are not for people like us. And every morning she answered them the same way, quietly, privately, without announcing it to anyone. Watch me. There was one person who did not need convincing. Lillian had been Comfort's closest friend since secondary school. The kind of friend made not by celebration but by a shared experience of having very little and choosing not to be diminished by it. Lillian had seen Comfort go without lunch to buy application forms. She had seen her borrow 20 naira to complete bus fare and still arrive at a government office on time to ask questions nobody else around her was asking. She had watched Comfort sit in public libraries reading things that had no immediate usefulness, except that Comfort believed, in the way some people believe in rain during dry season, that everything useful would eventually connect. Lillian did not call Comfort proud. She called her prepared. One afternoon, while they sat behind the school building sharing a sachet of water, Lillian looked at Comfort and said, Whatever you are planning, I will help you. Even if I cannot do much, I will stand beside you while you do it. Comfort looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, That is enough. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. The travel opportunity, when it finally became real, arrived with the kind of pressure that separates people who only dream from people who are willing to be broken by the process and still continue. There were forms to gather, documents to certify, offices to visit, fees to pay, and deadlines that did not care about poverty. Comfort ran home with the full information the evening she confirmed it was legitimate. Her heart loud in her chest, her hands slightly damp with the kind of hope that is also fear. She had prayed they would be different this time. The sitting room became a court. Steve said the whole thing was a scam, designed for people with more money than sense. Layla said Comfort had been watching too many films about people who traveled abroad and returned transformed. Dorcas said there was no money available to throw after something with no guarantee. Emmanuel set down his cup of tea, folded his hands, and said he would not sell a single thing he owned for a journey that could end in humiliation. Comfort sat in that room and felt the walls close slightly. She walked out with her throat tight and her jaw held firm so that nothing would escape from her face before she was alone. Outside, the evening was warm and ordinary. Comfort sat on a low bench and held the papers in both hands and breathed. Later, she found Lillian at the small kiosk by the roadside, where they sometimes sat when the world inside their houses became too loud. She told Lillian everything. Lillian listened without trying to soften it. Then Lillian said, Let their doubt remain here. You will not remain with it. Those were not dramatic words. They were not the kind of words you see on a poster. But they were the words that moved something from deciding to decided inside Comfort's chest. It was Lillian who followed her to offices when the heat was punishing. Lillian who helped her write letters. Lillian who called people she barely knew to ask questions that felt embarrassing to ask. Lillian who contributed money she had saved from small work, without announcements, placing it in Comfort's hand one morning and saying only, "For the processing fee, do not return it." There was one other small thing that happened during those weeks of processing that Comfort would not remember as important until much later. A man in the community, a quiet man named Fred, who sold building materials near the main road, had been going through a crisis that few people knew about, a business debt, a situation that had the texture of collapse. Comfort heard about it through Lillian, not because it was her business, but because Lillian mentioned it in passing. Comfort was not wealthy. She was barely managing, but she had a small amount she had been keeping for an emergency. Money from months of Mama Bissie's stand and market carrying and church hall sweeping. Without telling Lillian what she was doing or why, she quietly sent part of it to Fred through someone who knew him. She did not attach her name. She did not explain. She simply thought, if I was standing where he is standing right now, I would want someone to remember I was a person, not just a problem. She never mentioned it again, not even to Lillian. When the travel finally became confirmed, when the documents were in order and the date was real, Comfort stood in the room she had always shared and looked at the envelope in her hands for a long time. She told her family that evening. The response was not what she had spent months imagining. Dorcas offered a short, dry prayer at the doorway, the kind of prayer that felt like a formality rather than a blessing. Emmanuel warned her not to shame the family. Steve, who had called the whole thing a scam, said nothing. He looked at his phone. Layla asked if Comfort would bring her something nice when she arrived. At the airport, Comfort turned once and looked at the faces behind the barrier. Nobody was crying. Nobody was holding a sign. Lillian was the only one who had come without being asked, standing at the back with her hands folded in front of her, watching with the expression of someone who had believed in something for a long time and was now watching the first evidence arrive. Comfort pressed one hand briefly to her chest, toward Lillian. Then she turned and walked through. America did not welcome Comfort with comfort. The cold entered her the moment she stepped outside the airport. Not just the weather, cold, but the cold of a place that does not know your name and is not waiting for you to arrive. The buildings were large and indifferent. The people moved fast with the efficiency of a world that had no pause button. Comfort stood on a pavement outside the terminal with her one bag and the address of a distant contact written on a folded piece of paper, and she felt, for the first time since she had decided to refuse her family's doubt, genuinely afraid. She did not call home to say she was afraid. She found the address. She knocked. She was given a small room. She thanked the person and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and breathed. This is the beginning, she told herself, not the arrival. The beginning. The room she eventually rented alone was the kind of room that tells you everything about where a person is in their life. The bed touched one wall. The reading table touched another. A single window looked out onto a brick wall with a rusted pipe running down it. The fridge hummed quietly in the corner, and most nights, the sound it made was louder than anything inside it. She worked jobs that left marks on her body before they left anything in her account. She cleaned offices in the early morning before the workers arrived. She worked evenings in a food preparation facility, where she stood for hours in a cold room with gloves on and still felt the chill in her bones by the time she got home. She took an extra shift whenever one was offered, because extra shifts were the difference between a bill paid and a bill threatening. Some nights she ate bread and a boiled egg and called it dinner without embarrassment, because she had learned early that self-pity was a luxury she could not afford. Some mornings she stood in the bathroom before her shift and cried for exactly as long as it took the water to warm up. Then she washed her face, dried it, and went outside. She did not call home to describe any of this. When she called home, she said she was managing. She said it was hard, but she was learning. She kept her voice steady and answered their questions without adding her own truth to the answers. The first time she sent money home, it was a small amount. She had cut her own groceries to send it. She transferred it at night, sitting at the reading table under the single bulb, and watched the confirmation appear on her screen. The call from Dorcas came within the hour. "My blessed child," Dorcas said, and her voice was full and warm in a way Comfort had not heard before. "God will reward you. I have been telling everyone that my daughter abroad does not forget her family." Comfort pressed her phone against her ear and felt something soft open inside her chest. She had not known how much she needed to hear her mother's voice carry that particular warmth. She had not known how long she had been waiting for approval from that direction. Emmanuel prayed for her that evening with a gentleness that surprised her. His voice was different, not commanding, not dismissive, but tender in the way fathers can be when distance and gratitude soften them. Steve called her our star abroad. Layla posted about her sister on her phone. For a few weeks, Comfort felt that distance had finally made them see her. She worked harder. She sent more. Then the requests arrived. Dorcas needed money for food. The market prices had increased. Emmanuel needed money for the leaking roof. The zinc had gotten worse. Steve needed capital to start a small business. He had identified a good opportunity and just needed someone to believe in him. Layla needed school fees, then later a laptop for her program. Then money for a professional training she said would change her future. A cousin reached out about rent. An aunt had hospital bills. A relative, Comfort, had met perhaps twice at a family gathering, called her our only hope, with the ease of someone who had been practicing the phrase. Comfort gave. She gave because she loved them, because she remembered the compound and the cracked fingers and the notebook, and the belief that if she ever had anything, she would use it for the people who had nothing. She gave from love, not obligation. But nobody told her that the line between love and obligation blurs when giving becomes expected. She stopped sleeping adequately. She took shifts that started before sunrise and ended after dark. She cooked the cheapest thing she could find. She bought nothing for herself without guilt, as if her own comfort was something she had not yet earned. The warm coat she eventually bought because her body was struggling with the winters took her 3 weeks of mental arguments before she allowed herself to spend the money. The month she delayed sending because her own rent was due, Steve sent an angry message asking what was happening. Dorcas called and said America had changed her. Emmanuel sent a message, "Do not forget your family." Layla stopped saying please and began listing needs like a shopping order. At home, the compound was changing. The walls had been painted. The roof no longer leaked. Steve's business had opened with a proper signboard. Layla's education was continuing. Emmanuel walked with the quiet confidence of a man whose community respected him, partly because word had traveled that his daughter abroad was doing well. And Comfort, in her small room with the humming fridge and the unpaid bills on the chair, sat on the floor on a night when her phone would not stop lighting up and pressed her back against the bed frame. She did not answer. She sat in the silence and let the question she had been pushing down for months finally rise to the surface, the way things rise when there is no more room to hold them under. Do they love me? She whispered to nobody in the room. Or do they only love what I send? If you have ever carried a family that never once asked how heavy the weight was, like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, subscribe to this channel, and drop this in the comments. Some people only love what you can give them. The morning Comfort lost her job began like any other day, and that was what made it more unsettling when everything changed. She woke up before her alarm, as she often did, her body already used to long days and short nights. The room was still dim, and the quiet hum of the fridge filled the space in a way that had become familiar to her. She sat up slowly, stretched her back, and reached for her phone. There were no missed calls yet, and for a brief moment, that felt like peace. She boiled water for tea and stood by the small window as she drank, watching people pass outside. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, moving with purpose, heading somewhere that mattered. Comfort dressed, tied her hair neatly, and looked at herself in the mirror for a few seconds longer than usual. She told herself she would be fine, picked up her bag, and stepped out. When she arrived at work, nothing looked different at first. The reception area was the same. The air carried the same faint smell of cleaning solution, and the routine movements of people around her continued as usual. But there was a slight tension in the atmosphere that she could not immediately explain. When a colleague told her the manager wanted her to see her, she felt a small shift in her chest, though she tried to ignore it. She walked into the manager's office and immediately noticed the small white box on the desk. Before a word was spoken, something inside her already understood. The manager explained that there had been a restructuring and that some roles were being cut. Comfort listened carefully, hoping there was still room for discussion, for reconsideration, for anything that could change what she was hearing. She tried to explain that she was hardworking, that she could take more shifts, that she was willing to do whatever was necessary to keep her position. But the decision had already been made, and nothing she said could change it. When the manager pushed the box toward her and said she was sorry, that was when it became final. Comfort gathered at things quietly. The items in the box were small, but they carried the weight of routine and survival. She thanked the manager, even though the words felt empty, and walked out of the building, holding the box against her chest. Outside, life continued as if nothing had happened. People walked past her, cars moved along the road, and somewhere nearby, someone laughed loudly. Comfort stood there for a moment, feeling disconnected from everything around her. It was not that she had broken down immediately. Instead, everything inside her became still, as if her mind needed time to catch up with what had just happened. For the first few days, she refused to panic. She woke up early each morning, dressed as though she still had somewhere to go, and spent her time searching for new opportunities. She updated her applications, visited different workplaces, and checked online listings for anything available. She told herself that this was only temporary, that something else would come soon. But as the days passed, nothing changed. A week went by, then another, and the silence from job applications became harder to ignore. Her savings, which she had once guarded carefully, began to reduce steadily. Each expense now felt heavier because it was no longer being replaced. It was during this period that the calls from home began again. Dorcas called one evening while Comfort was sitting on her bed, reviewing what remained in her account. She spoke about the house, about the carpenter who needed to be paid, and about the expectation that Comfort would send money as usual. When Comfort explained that things were tight and asked for a little time, Dorcas responded with disbelief, as though the idea of difficulty in America did not make sense to her. Steve followed with messages asking about money for his business, reminding Comfort of commitments she had made in the past. Layla also reached out, speaking about her own needs and expectations. Each conversation carried a tone that made it clear they were not asking out of concern, but out of assumption. For the first time since she had started sending money home, Comfort could not send anything. That was when the change in their attitude became obvious. The warmth that had once filled their voices disappeared quickly. Steve began to speak to her with irritation, accusing her of becoming selfish. Layla's tone became more demanding, less patient. Dorcas expressed disappointment in ways that felt heavy and deliberate. Even Emmanuel, who rarely spoke much, sent a message reminding her not to forget her family. Comfort read that message several times, unsure how to respond. Eventually, she decided to tell them the truth. She called for a family discussion and explained everything clearly. She told them she had lost her job, that she had been trying to find another one without success, and that her financial situation had become difficult. She asked for help, even if it was temporary, explaining that she needed support to stabilize herself and pursue another opportunity. She expected hesitation. She expected concern. She expected, at the very least, an attempt. What she received instead was distance. Steve said his business was not doing well and that he could not assist. Layla said she had her own problems to deal with. Dorcas questioned why Comfort had not saved more money. Emmanuel remained silent throughout most of the conversation, offering no reassurance and no support. Then, from somewhere in the background, someone made a remark that cut deeply, suggesting that America had rejected her. That moment stayed with her long after the call ended. Comfort sat quietly, holding her phone, unable to cry immediately. The pain did not come out as tears at first. It settled inside her heavily, forcing her to sit with it. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways that were not dramatic, but deeply exhausting. Her living conditions became more strained as her money reduced. She began skipping meals more often, not out of choice, but necessity. She sold some of her belongings to manage expenses, letting go of things she had worked hard to afford. She borrowed from a few people, though doing so made her uncomfortable. Each request for help carried a weight of embarrassment that grew heavier over time. Still, she continued searching for work, hoping something would change, but nothing did. Eventually, she made the decision she had been avoiding. She returned home. Arriving in Nigeria brought a sense of familiarity, but not comfort. The heat felt familiar on her skin, but the emotional distance she experienced upon returning was impossible to ignore. When she reached her family's compound, she noticed immediately that things had improved. The house had been repaired, the walls were freshly painted, and Steve's business was clearly visible at the front. Everything she had contributed to was now standing as proof of her effort. however. The reception she received was not what she had imagined. Dorcas greeted her, but without warmth. Emmanuel acknowledged her presence without much expression. Layla observed her quietly, noticing the simplicity of her appearance. Steve's response was the most direct, asking if she had returned empty-handed. Comfort chose not to respond to that question. Life in the compound quickly became uncomfortable. Dorcas began to complain about increased expenses, suggesting that Comfort's presence was adding pressure. Layla distanced herself, avoiding situations where Comfort might be seen by her friends. Steve openly spoke about her failure, telling others she had wasted her opportunity abroad. Emmanuel remained mostly silent, offering neither support nor correction. Comfort continued to search for work, moving from place to place, asking questions and trying to rebuild something for herself. Some days she returned home without any progress. Other days she avoided returning early, choosing instead to sit outside and gather herself before facing the atmosphere inside. One afternoon, while she was washing clothes behind the house, she overheard Steve speaking to two men near his shop. He spoke about her in a way that reduced her to usefulness, saying that she had value when she was sending money, but now needed to find her own way. The words stayed with her. One of the men laughed, but the other remained quiet. That man was Fred. He had come to the shop for a purchase, but hearing Comfort's name brought back a memory he had not forgotten. At a time when he had faced serious difficulty, help had come to him quietly. He had not known the full story behind it, but he remembered the impact it had made. Later that evening, he asked where Comfort was and went to find her. He saw her sitting near a closed kiosk, calm but clearly burdened. When he called her name, she looked up with a mixture of recognition and uncertainty. Fred sat beside her and asked a simple question: what had happened? For the first time in a long while, Comfort spoke without holding anything back. She did not exaggerate, and she did not try to make herself look stronger than she felt. She simply explained her situation. Fred listened carefully, without interrupting her. And for the first time since everything began to fall apart, Comfort felt that someone was not looking at her as a problem to solve or a burden to carry, but as a person to understand. Fred did not rush to speak after Comfort finished explaining her situation. He allowed a brief silence to settle between them. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that gives space for everything that has been said to rest properly. Then he reached into his pocket and brought out an envelope. At first, Comfort did not pay attention to it. She assumed it was something unrelated. But when he placed it gently in her hand, she looked down, confused. "I cannot take this," she said almost immediately, trying to hand it back. Fred shook his head. "You can." Comfort hesitated. "No, I don't even know how I will return it." Fred's expression remained calm. "This is not about returning anything." She looked at him more closely now, trying to understand. "You helped me once," he continued. "At a time when I had no way forward. You did not say anything. You did not wait for me to ask, but that help stayed with me. Let this one stay with you." Comfort's fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. She remembered then. It had been a small amount to her at the time, given quietly, without expecting anything back. She had not even thought he would know it came from her. "You knew?" she asked softly. "I did not know immediately," Fred replied, "but I found out, and I did not forget." Comfort lowered her gaze. For a moment, she struggled to hold herself together. It was not just the money, it was the recognition. The fact that someone had remembered her kindness, even when her own family had forgotten everything she had done. She opened the envelope slowly. The amount inside was not excessive, but it was enough. Enough to begin again, enough to breathe. Tears came this time, quietly but freely. Not out of weakness, but from relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice unsteady. Fred nodded. "Use it well. That is enough." A few days later, Comfort rented a small shop at the corner of a busy street. It was not in a prime location, and the structure itself was simple. The walls needed cleaning, the shelves were not complete, and the space felt bare. But it was hers, and that mattered more than anything else. She started small, very small. She bought only what she could afford, choosing items carefully and arranging them with attention. Every product on the shelf had a purpose. Every expense was recorded. She no longer had the luxury of mistakes. Each morning, she opened the shop early. She swept the front, wiped the surfaces, and arranged her goods before the street became fully active. She carried a small flask of tea with her and sometimes sat quietly before the first customer arrived, preparing herself mentally for the day. At the beginning, business was slow. Some days passed with only a few customers. Some people entered, asked for prices, and left without buying anything. There were hours when she sat alone, watching others move about their businesses, wondering if she would ever reach that level of stability again. But this time, she did not panic. She had learned something from everything she had gone through. She had learned that growth does not always come quickly, and that patience, when combined with discipline, creates something stronger than desperation. Fred visited occasionally, never interfering, only observing. He would ask simple questions, offer small advice when necessary, and leave without making his presence feel heavy. "Take your time," he told her one evening. "What grows slowly usually lasts longer." Comfort nodded. She understood that now. Gradually, things began to change. A woman who bought from her once returned again and brought someone else. A man who appreciated her honesty recommended her to a friend. Comfort treated every customer with respect, regardless of how small the purchase was. She did not exaggerate prices, and she did not rush conversations unnecessarily. People began to trust her. That trust became her advantage. Within a few months, her business stabilized. She was able to restock without struggling, manage her expenses more confidently, and maintain consistency. She still lived carefully, but the constant fear she once carried began to reduce. Her appearance also began to reflect the change. She looked healthier, more composed, and more grounded. The exhaustion that once defined her had softened into quiet strength. And as expected, her progress did not remain hidden. News reached her family. At first, it was dismissed. Steve assumed it was exaggerated. Layla suggested that someone must be supporting her secretly. Dorcas questioned whether Comfort was being honest about her situation. Emmanuel began asking questions more directly. Eventually, curiosity turned into action. Steve was the first to visit. He arrived at the shop one afternoon, trying to appear relaxed. Comfort was arranging items on a shelf when she noticed him standing at the entrance. "Comfort," he said with a smile that did not fully reach his eyes. "This place looks good." Comfort turned to face him. "Good afternoon." There was a slight pause before he continued. "You are doing well?" he added. "I am happy for you." She nodded politely but did not engage further. Steve walked around the shop, observing the arrangement, touching a few items as if assessing their quality. Then he moved closer to her. "My business has been a bit slow lately," he began. "You know how things are now. Suppliers are increasing prices and customers are not buying like before." Comfort listened quietly. "I was thinking," he continued, "if you could support me again, just for a while, I can stabilize things." There was no anger in his tone, only expectation. Comfort looked at him carefully before responding. "When I needed help," she said calmly. "What did you tell me?" Steve shifted slightly. "That situation was different." Comfort shook her head. "That was the only time I needed my family." Steve's expression changed. "So you will not help your own brother?" "I will not return to a place where I am only valued when I am given," she replied. "That is not help. That is dependence." Steve did not argue further. He left, clearly dissatisfied. Dorcas came a few days later. Her approach was softer, more emotional. She spoke about family, about forgiveness, about the importance of unity. She reminded Comfort of their bond as mother and daughter, and tried to frame the past as a misunderstanding. Comfort listened patiently. "I am not angry that I helped you," she said after Dorcas finished. "I am hurt that when I needed support, you blamed me instead." Dorcas attempted to justify her actions, but the words did not carry the same authority they once had. Layla's visit followed shortly after. She came with warmth and familiarity, speaking as though nothing had changed. She mentioned a project she wanted to start and explained why she needed financial support. Comfort did not respond immediately. Instead, she reminded Layla of the times she had stood by her, supported her education, and responded whenever she asked for help. "And when I returned," Comfort added, "you avoided me." Layla tried to defend herself, but her argument lacked strength. "This is not punishment," Comfort said gently. This is understanding. The situation eventually led to a family meeting. Emmanuel called everyone together, stating that the issue had gone too far and needed to be addressed properly. Comfort agreed to attend, not because she needed approval, but because she wanted clarity. They gathered in the same sitting room that had once dismissed her dreams. The environment had improved, but the tension remained. Emmanuel spoke about unity and the importance of not allowing money to divide the family. His tone suggested authority, but it lacked the firmness it once carried. Comfort listened, then responded. Money did not divide this family, she said. It only revealed what was already there. The room became quiet. She spoke calmly without raising her voice, but every word carried weight. She reminded them of everything she had done, the support she had provided, the sacrifices she had made, and the consistency she had maintained. Then she spoke about her lowest moment, when she lost her job, when she asked for help, and when she was met with rejection and silence. I carried this family when I had strength, she said. But when I needed support, I stood alone. No one interrupted her. Fred, who had quietly arrived with Lillian, stood nearby. Lillian also spoke, reminding the family of how they had treated Comfort's dreams in the beginning. For the first time, there was no argument, only reflection. Comfort stood up. I do not hate any of you, she said, but I will not allow myself to be used. Again, I will help when I can, but not at the cost of my own stability. This time, no one challenged her, because they knew she meant it. After that family meeting, something shifted permanently, not just in the way Comfort related to her family, but in the way they related to her. For the first time, there were no immediate demands, no urgent calls, no emotional pressure disguised as concern. There was distance, but it was a different kind of distance. It was no longer the distance of neglect. It was the distance of adjustment, as each of them began to understand that the version of Comfort they had depended on was no longer available. Comfort returned to her shop the next morning and opened as usual. She did not replay the meeting in her mind or try to measure whether her words had changed anything. What mattered to her now was consistency. She had learned that peace did not come from being understood by everyone, but from being clear with herself. Her business continued to grow steadily. She expanded her inventory gradually, adding new items based on what her customers requested most. She paid attention to patterns, tracked her sales carefully, and avoided unnecessary risks. Within a year, she was able to move into a slightly larger space in a better location. It was not a dramatic transformation, but it was significant enough to show progress. She also hired 2 young women to assist her. Both of them came from backgrounds similar to hers, and she treated them with a level of patience and respect she had once wished for. She did not just pay them, she taught them how to manage stock, how to speak to customers, and how to think long-term. This time, she was not just building a business, she was building with awareness. Back at the family house, things were no longer as comfortable as before. Steve's business began to struggle more visibly. Without consistent external support, he had to confront the gaps in his own discipline. He had never fully learned how to manage growth or sustain consistency, because for a long time, whenever things became difficult, Comfort had stepped in to stabilize everything. Now there was no one stepping in. His frustration grew, but it slowly turned inward. He worked longer hours, made adjustments, and began to realize that running a business required more than initial capital. Layla also faced her own challenges. Without relying on Comfort, she had to take responsibility for her decisions and commitments. The ease she once operated with disappeared, replaced by a more realistic understanding of effort and consequence. Dorcas changed in quieter ways. She became more careful with her words, less quick to complain, and more aware of how her reactions affected others. Though she did not always say it directly, there was a visible shift in how she spoke about Comfort to others. There was less entitlement and more acknowledgement. Emmanuel carried his own form of reflection. His silence, which had once allowed things to go unchecked, now became something he seemed to reconsider. He spoke more intentionally, intervened when necessary, and carried a quieter, more thoughtful presence in the household. These changes did not happen overnight, and they were not perfect, but they were real. Comfort did not cut her family off completely. She visited occasionally, but her visits were different now. She no longer arrived with the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She came as a daughter, not as a provider. When she helped, she did so within limits and without guilt. There were moments of awkwardness at first, especially during the early visits. Conversations felt careful, as though everyone was still learning how to relate to her again. But over time, a new balance formed, not the same as before, but healthier. Fred remained part of her life, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady and respectful presence. He would stop by her shop from time to time, check on her progress, and offer advice when necessary. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, not dependency. Lillian, as always, remained consistent. She visited often, celebrated Comfort's progress sincerely, and reminded her of how far she had come, especially during moments when Comfort became too focused on what was still ahead. One evening, after closing her shop, Comfort stood outside for a few minutes before heading home. The street was calmer, the noise reduced to a low hum of distant movement. The lights from nearby shops reflected softly on the ground, and the air carried a quiet stillness. She looked around at what she had built. Not everything was perfect, but it was hers, and it was stable. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel everything fully. The journey, the loss, the rebuilding, and the lessons that came with it. She thought about the version of herself who once sat on the floor of a small room, staring at unpaid bills and wondering if love had conditions attached to it. She thought about the day she returned home with nothing, and how quickly value had been taken away from her. And she thought about where she stood now, not defined by what she could give, but by what she had learned. She exhaled slowly and said, quietly but clearly, I did not lose everything. I just learned what truly matters. The truth is simple, but many people learn it too late. When someone sacrifices for you, it is not an obligation you are entitled to. It is a choice they made out of care, and it deserves respect. The moment kindness is treated like a duty, it begins to lose its meaning. Family is not defined by how much you can take from one person, but by how willing you are to stand with them when they have nothing left to give. Loyalty is not proven during comfort, but during difficulty. It is important to help others, especially those close to you, but it is equally important to protect yourself from being drained without appreciation. Giving without boundaries can lead to resentment, and love without wisdom can be misused. At some point, everyone must learn the difference between supporting others and losing themselves. Comfort learned that lesson the hard way, but she did learn it. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, subscribe to the channel for more powerful African stories, and tell me what you have learned from this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.